And one of the things that kind of started coming up more regularly, we would go out to get pizza on times that we were celebrating things. You know, we would go on a dirt bike motorcycle ride, we'd come back, or we'd go to a wrestling match and come home, and pizza time. Pizza seemed like the coolest thing ever to me. So cool that I felt like I envisioned a future where I would not be in the town that I grew up in, which was Kent, Ohio, and I would have to deal with the potential of not having good pizza. And so, and of course I had this warped sense of what good pizza was at the time that I have a much broader sense now. But at the time I thought pizza might as well have been invented in Kent, Ohio. And it was the greatest thing ever. And I want to just be able to make the best and have it wherever I go. And so that's sort of what has sort of driven me along the way on a background level. I worked with a guy who showed me a little bit about making bread, and he gave me some really broad and weird instructions. He said use about 6 cups of flour, use about this much water, some yeast, and some salt, and put it all together, and then just try to, you just have to work and try to get all the flour, as much flour into it as you can. And I thought, well, that sounds easy. And I did that, and as a wrestler and a guy with 4 brothers, I could get a lot of flour into it, and so I ended up getting way too much flour, and it ended up being like a total brick. I'm literally like a brick, and weird and no good. And I learned, and I thought, well, his bread isn't quite like that. He must. Who knows? I didn't know exactly, but at the time, I'm realizing more and more, like, okay, well, getting a lot of flour into it is not what his version of that and my version of that were very different. And so the process has kind of evolved and grown, and I moved away from Ohio and thought, well, here's my chance. I got to start practicing, and I have worked in, I think, 3 or 4 pizzerias, and helped start a pizzeria, and the one right around the corner here called The Wheel, and I'll talk about that as part of my thing a little bit more extensively. But that's the who in all this. I have 4 kids myself, and we're celebrating all the time, and pizza still is one of the primary things to celebrate. The what, of course, was pizza at the time, and we'll get into the details of how that sort of evolved. The why is you've heard the why, how I thought I wanted it all the time. Then what comes up is, okay, well, what are we doing here today? Sourdough, and what does that mean? One of the things I've also done is I've traveled a lot in Alaska, remotely, and being out in the middle of nowhere, coming into some lodge after traveling across the full length of the Alaska range. I would come into some little lodge, and my buddy would say, oh, my buddy, meaning me, knows how to make pizza. So they would turn their kitchen over to me, and then I would whip up a big dinner of pizza out in the middle of nowhere, sometimes with sourdough, sometimes with yeast, if that's what they had. But it was an opportunity for me to, again, make what I thought was the greatest way to celebrate ever. And so I guess at that point I felt like I kind of got the introduction to what sourdough was in a very loose level, and I'd say at that point I forgot about it almost as quickly, and since I would come back into civilization, and why would I think about sourdough necessarily if I could just go buy yeast off the shelf and have it be very regimented, kind of like the way a recipe calls for. 2 teaspoons of yeast and 4 cups of flour, yada yada. Pretty easy. But sourdough is not that easy and not quite the same. And it's a fermentation process, and it's a kind of almost like the beginning of something that's starting to go bad a little bit, and it starts that busyness of what somebody called Saccharomyces cerevisiae or something like that. It's a little one-celled organism that does what it changes the sugars and the carbohydrates in the flour and turns them into gas, and that's what inflates the gluten structures in the dough, and it kind of helps make the dough rise. That's what it does, and you get a little bit of a sense of what that is. And And a little bit of sense of what that is when you drink apple cider, or when your apple juice turns into apple cider and gets kind of extra vibrant and becomes a little alcoholic a little bit. So all that stuff is super fun, and again, I'm no biochemist, but we'll talk a little bit about that more fully. Natural leavening is what I'm going to call what we're doing. Let me jump back and say, sourdough is a few different things. I'm going to be talking mainly about the idea of natural leavening as what people think of when they think of sourdough. I'm not going to be particularly talking about the history of sourdough and breads with sourdough starters coming from Europe and all this stuff, or I rode my bicycle from Alaska down to San Francisco, and we would see signs, 100-year-old starter, and I'm like, what does that even mean? I had no idea at the time, but I know that what it means now is that they're able to, in Alaska, they can have a starter that looks a lot like this, kind of nasty and ugly, and it hardly looks like there's any real vibrancy going on in it, and you can let this sit out in this kind of weather. This is kind of a typical Alaska weather, and you can let it sit out for a very long time, even, who knows, 6 months conceivably, and you can just start it right back up, and well, boom, you got bread the next day. And in Alaska, refrigeration and outdoor temperatures and all these things kind of make for a great opportunity to have sourdough be the easy way to make bread, because getting to the store to get yeast is not as easy in Alaska. So that's a good place for me to reference it, because I have been there a lot. I did do a little bit of research to talk about this today, and I found out that commercial yeast started in around 1800, and it was, so before that it was pretty much sourdough starters and brewer's yeast, which is what they would pull off of making barley, beer, and things like that, and they would, I guess, pull off the cream off the top, and it had all these enzymes in it that would facilitate making the dough quickly, and that's how they would start it. And modern day active dry yeast is something that has sort of evolved in the late 1800s, I believe. Is when it kind of started really turning into being available places and being able to make that happen. And it was interesting, I read that even the notion of, there's more chairs over there, I think you can, if you don't mind standing, that's fine, but there's chairs too. The whole idea of biochemistry pretty much started because of yeast and them wanting to understand what was happening in that process of fermentation. And Louis Pasteur and all this business. So it's cool to think about the history. I'm not especially a big history buff, but it is fun to understand kind of like the background of these kind of things. I think this is the point where I'm going to start working on. Any questions about that so far? I'm going to start on the bagels. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on the bagels. Bagels dough was made yesterday. I took 400 grams of starter. Trying to think about how many. 1,600 grams of flour, all high gluten bread flour, and some salt, some barley syrup, and some sugar. Mixed it all together, kind of created the liquid part, I created a roux kind of where it was all dissolved in the water. It was brown with the barley syrup, and then I put in the flour, and it just quickly comes together. You don't hardly have to knead it at all. As soon as it almost comes together, you can let it set. In this case, I let it set for about 3 hours. And then I cut it up into 125 gram balls, and I made little balls out of them. Then I used the pinch method, where you just sort of take a ball and pinch it in the middle and kind of loosen it up and pop it in the second stage of this, and let it rise for another couple of hours. And so what we've got here is some fun little bagels ready to go in the water. Bagels are cooked in water, and we're going to start that process. This, my son, his name's Dare. He's the Pizziolo at the wheel, and He's assisting me today with this stuff. We'll ask him about the wheel a little bit later, but he's going to help me a little bit with orchestrating, getting these things all in and out. So I might not be able to stay fully engaged in talking while this is happening, but it won't take long, I don't think. But putting bagels in the water is easy. There's nothing else in this water. The barley flavor is what helps it. We're going to let it sit just a minute on each side. I'm going to pull them out here. I'm going to put some seeds on them, and I'm going to put them over here on a tray, and then we're going to go in the oven here that I've got on this little island. Anyone who wants to get up and take a look, the bagels just float in the water. I got this thing on high. You'll also see a picture of them floating in the water over there. But sometimes at my home oven or home stove, I'd say that I'm able to turn the heat up higher, but this is all the way on high. But putting cold, in this case, these are all been refrigerated. So after the 2 hours, the second rise on them, they've already been shaped and they've been sitting in here for 2 hours at room temperature, and then they go into a refrigerator that allows them to be pulled off whenever I need them. So that's why I'm able to make them here in the middle of the day without having to wake up at 2 in the morning to start the process.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of putting in the water?
It creates a nice softness, chewiness, and what ends up being a crustiness once they come out of the oven. Okay. My sense is the history of bagels is that they were invented in Poland, maybe as early as the 1600s, and they didn't become what they are today in terms of all the hoopla around bagels and passionate, excited fans of them until I think mostly the Jewish culture brought them into New York and New York City, and people love them. And then I would say that happened in the 1700s, I think, and then they really hit a powerful resurgence of popularity in the 1970s, and that's when I was a kid. So I think that's when I first even heard about them. And
do you have to bring the water to a boil and keep it at a boil, or
Yeah.
just to simmer? Okay.
yeah, I mean, I'd say that because you're putting the cold dough in it, you just keep it as hot as you can get it.
Did you say 10 minutes on each side?
1 minute on each side of this. So they're just gonna be in here for a little bit. I probably went a little long in that first half.
How long can you keep them in the fridge for when they're prepped?
That would be a great part of the discussion, but I would say that one thing that's really beautiful about the process is that when something's in the refrigerator, it almost slows this fermentation process to a halt. So what that means is that you can keep it for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, who knows? I mean, the answer is what the temperature is really comes down to being critical. If it were truly 34 degrees, or even if it were, let's just say 30 degrees, conceivably they can get frozen in that state and then come back out, and you might be able to do that for a really long time. I would say one of the things that came up when I got tasked to work at the wheel, the owner of the wheel said, well, one of the things that is kind of cool about pizza dough in New Haven, which is what we were kind of shooting for, they let their dough rise for 72 hours. And I was like, what? That sounds so crazy. And of course the answer is they refrigerate. That's how you let it rise that long. It's conceivably possible to let it rise that long without refrigeration, but it would require a lot of detail with the amount of yeast and the temperature in the room. So conceivably, you could let something rise for 72 hours at, quote, room temperature, if the room temperature was 60, and you put just the tiniest little bit of yeast in.
So do you think, like, for say, like, if you left a dough out for 24 hours, do you think it'd be past the 74-hour fermentation in the refrigerator? Because I find refrigerator does nothing and holds it in stasis. So I always find it to be.
Well, I would say it does.
The water absorbs more. It seems like maybe more water solubility to flour, like less, but. doesn't change the flavor at all.
I would say that I'm not sure that it really changes the flavor. It's part of the process, and it may change some of the natural elasticity in the dough, meaning that it actually might help the gluten structure in the dough to be more elastic, which would in effect give it a little bit more rise, right?
Yeah, so if you were in a hurry to get it done, keep it the same amount of time, you'd probably leave it out a little bit longer and then fridge it down and probably 24 hours maybe somewhat.
Again, the details of temperature and time are so interconnected that everything matters.
Yeah, I just want your opinion on it.
Yeah.
Of my situation.
Yeah, I think the answer is you can make pizza dough in 1 hour. From being in a flour bag to eating pizza. If you put enough yeast in it and the temperature in the room is right, it doesn't end up being as good. And I think in that regard, that's why I think these pizzerias say, let's go 72 hours, that seems like a good number. And one of the coolest things about that is that the difference between 72 hours and 1 day earlier or 1 day later, at the refrigerator level is almost no difference.
So Paul, my question is around flavor, actually. It's interesting you're talking about this
Yeah.
because I find that if you do a fast rise, you have no flavor.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that it certainly doesn't help in terms of flavor.
But you
right?
don't have an optimal time when you're making the breads or any of the other the pizza doughs for how long. Slow down, cool it down a bit, and let it rise as long as possible. I find it gets more complex flavors.
Yeah, I think that, it's yes, but I would all just say that it's a little bit like it's nuanced. And the difference, somebody who's not savvy to the details of things might not even notice.
Gotta let it rise at room temperature once they take it out of the refrigerator?
Yeah, you can take it out of the refrigerator and let it continue rising potentially, depending on whether it's been fully proofed or not, right? I'm making 24 of these things, so it's gonna.
What is fully proof? Fully proof is the second rising and then you refrigerate?
Again, let's talk about that. That's, I would say, a nuanced detail and a lot of watching. One of the things that happens when you're making dough is you're looking at the rise. One of the most common phrases that you'll hear when making the bread is "let it double in the first rise," and then after that, it's not nearly so easy to say, "Oh, when is it ready?" And the only way to really know what is best is to have done it too long and to have done it too short. Once you've done it both ways, you can whittle it down and make a little bit adjustments. And again, what you did yesterday and the temperature that it was yesterday might not be the same thing today. And so,
Does it feel like a regular bread, if you poke your finger in it and it bounces back, it's ready?
yeah. I'll say this, I don't think that I have never felt that any little detail or little trick like that has made it to where I feel like it answers the question exactly, like precisely or anything like that.
I'm glad you say that. That's my experience because it's different every single time.
Yeah.
And you have to have a little relationship.
Yeah, I'd say that's true, and I think that flexibility and that sense that you have of it, the sort of taking the pulse of it and the experience over time, to think that you can make sourdough for a week and have a couple successful loaves does not mean that you're great at it, and that's why I preface the whole thing by, I'm no expert here. I've had a lot of success and feel super good. This is one of my plates. I wanted to see if we can get in here. Hey, Tyler, welcome. Came down from Portland. Woohoo!
Ooh, wow. If you want some chairs, they're over here.
So bagels. We're going to try to cook these off, and sometimes it amounts to feeling a little bit like the process gets confounding a bit, but it's not that bad. Bagels are worth it, I think.
have a first one where you can find it. Your recipe's all there.
Yeah, that's a great subject. I'd say that I've looked at a lot of books, and one thing I can say is that almost,
You personally.
I don't.
You don't have like
A go-to
a
book?
worksheet or anything, yeah, no.
No. I'd say I've developed things and I created a system at the wheel, the pizzeria. This is the one place that I've had a chance to have an impact. And I was able to learn enough about sourdough, create an example or a living prototype of what we thought was, this is what we want. Yes, this is it. And then say, okay, how can we do this every day for every single pizza that comes out of the oven? 100 to 150 pizzas a night, right? And the answer is, it's not incredibly, I'll say, here it is. It's been 5 years since we made it happen. And I'd say the amount of times that we've had any challenges with that has really been very, very few. So the answer is, we figured, I guess, has kind of figured out how to make the process work well enough that I can hand it over to other people, they can do it, and it's working. If you go to the wheel, you can have pizza, and I'd say you'll be wowed by it. Almost every review of it on Google or whatever it is, Yelp, almost everyone says the crust was out of this world. So it's cool, and I like the crust. So. The edge of the crust is called the cornicione. That's Italian. I'm not Italian, so I may not be pronouncing it right. I have a German cousin that every time we have gone over there for just a few times, I try to say something in German or Italian, and he seems like he's just repeating it back just the way that I'm saying it, but he's clearly trying to say that I'm not saying it right. So we may have to put the third batch in. Might not all go to the oven at once. So it's fun watching. I watch some videos on people making bagels, and it's fun to see how dynamic a big bagel shop is, and how many they pop in. They don't do them like this. They just shake them all over, and they all fall into once, and then they just take a thing and just stir it around. And of course, they're making thousands every day. I only get to make a couple dozen sometimes.
Have you thought about opening a bagel shop
Yeah.
in South Eugene?
I thought about it. I'll tell you the story a little bit. Of course, I thought about opening up a pizzeria, and the crazy reason why I was available when the wheel opened was because I got fired the day before from working at organically grown produce company. They laid off 65 people in one day, and I came home and I said, wow, that was the most traumatic thing that I really probably ever experienced, to feel like I had a great job, everything was going well, and now all of a sudden I'm out of work, and I've got 4 kids and a wife to take care of, and what's going to happen? So I called this guy named Steve, who runs the taco bar here in town, and he said he was opening up a pizzeria, and I said, what's up? What's your deal with your pizzeria? I heard you're starting one, and how's it going? And he said, well, things aren't going that good. I put an ad in Craigslist, and it's been a month, I think he said. Almost nobody seemed to be qualified. And I said, well, I'm interested. And we drank a beer or two, and before long I was hired. Then after I was hired, he said, what do you know about sourdough? And I said, well, I don't know anything about sourdough. And so I said, okay, well, that's what we want to do. So I let's get started on figuring out how to work sourdough. So that's why I'm extra excited about it. It was a very exciting time for me in the process of that, and it gave me the chance to really become like a little science guy and numbers guy. Nobody couldn't ask questions to hardly anybody. It didn't seem like. I did get a chance, interestingly, to work at New Day Bakery and work with them and see what their sourdough programs look like. And this is after working at the wheel, and they don't have the same kind of system. I would say they have probably what I think of as like a medieval European system by which their starter is like a liquid, and they feed it 24 hours instead of 12 hours, and the vibrancy and vitality of it is not the same as what we're making here and what the pizzeria is. And so it's very interesting. Question?
I'm interested in what you do at home with your sourdough starter. Like, you're gonna talk to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy to talk about when I got a point to thing.
Oh.
I'm gonna. The process of making these bagels is pretty simple. I can see that I'm going to have trouble fitting them all into the oven, and so that'll be part of the trickiness of it. In the sense that it'd be great if they could all just be in there at the same time. So I'm just, on these bagels today, I'm just using all the different seeds. I got black sesame seeds and salt and garlic. And, my wife's favorite. She's not here today because she's had so many, she felt like she could not have to be here today. I got my oven set at 450. And one of my racks is not level. All right, so one of the things I learned in this process, and I'll show it to you guys. I got this little tray of lava rocks, and my lava rocks are my little steamer. The home oven doesn't really do a very good job of keeping steam in it, so what I've got is a bunch of ice we're going to put on here. And this will make enough steam for me to make some bagels and allow them to do what they do.
So is that like leca, just the plant rocks?
One moment, let me. So cook these bagels. I put them in that steam room at 475 for 10 minutes, and then I'll pull this tray of ice out. It'll diminish the steam and continue to bake them a little bit. I'll lower the temperature to 450 and cook them another 6 or 8 minutes. Then they'll be ready to roll. Okay?
Lower into what?
450,
From?
475.
So you steam first at 475, then you pull it out and leave that, what you've created, cook the rest.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll take a look at them and see if I need to rotate them too. These ones right here, sadly, are going to have to get baked off after. All these details about these bagels are on the Hummingbird Wholesale website. You can look at the whole recipe exactly, even the full details of instructions. Hummingbirdwholesale.com. This is where I work my day job. And I'm the marketing guy. Just got done with the website refresh. So you'll find it easily and it'll be great. If I'm looking at the time, looks like it's 11:34. So it should, yeah?
Do you want more light?
I'm fine. I think Any questions about bagels? The only thing next we really have to do is, if you have questions, and then we just have to taste them. And Dare's working on having a plain cream cheese ready, and a herb veggie cream cheese, and we'll also have some sliced jalapenos if you want it a little spicy. And with the number of people in here, we'll probably easily be able to eat a half a bagel if you want one. Okay?
I have a question. Your recipe is in grams. Do you just use
It's a great question.
a scale, or how do you?
Yeah, I've got a little scale here. Something like this is what I recommend. I'd say, I'll say this. Volumes of things like flour are really challenging. Every flour is going to be a little different, and what I've understood and what I have figured out for myself is that a scale like this, you measured in grams, gives you the best sense of consistency and something you can count on. Everything at the wheel is set up in weighing in grams, and I'd say whether it's grams or whether it's pounds and ounces, I don't know that nobody's measuring in cups at the bakery, for example. Though it's interesting though that almost all recipes for home use are in cups, because they don't expect that every home cook is going to have a scale. But if you're serious about sourdough, I'd say it helps to give you a little bit of science behind what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just guessing. I feel like I can easily, feed my starter without my scale now on a regular basis, but I'd still want to have it checked and double checked in terms of ratios once in a while just to get it back on track. But there's a lot of consistency to the scale can give you.
Would you, do you have the starter recipe that you use and how you maintain it
Yeah,
on the
that's
website?
next. That's next on the list.
That's so important.
I'll say that the starter, I don't have a starter recipe on Hummingbird, but I'll tell you where to go. And it's where I'll say that if I have any questions about sourdough, this is where I go. It's called Perfect Loaf, or The Perfect Loaf. I'm not sure 100% whether it's The Perfect or just perfectloaf.com. But this guy, his name is Maurizio, and I'd say if you think that I'm kind of geeking out in this stuff, this guy geeks out. Big time. Like super big time. I mean, he is so detailed and so methodical and just nails it on a regular basis. And he can take amazing photos.
There's perfectloaf.com or the.
Yeah, perfectloaf.com. So that. In my mind, if I can send you away with one thing that's going to make your bread better, look at it. His website is a great place to find information. He's got a beginner's sourdough loaf. If you follow that, you will make probably the best loaf of bread that's ever come out of your oven.
I don't jump ahead, but when you make a starter like that, then you keep a little bit, you always keep using that?
Yeah. Let's talk about that. So I'm trying to watch my clock here. I'm going to go
Sorry.
11:30. Yeah, no worries. We're going to talk about that right now. 11:34 is when I put these in, or about that, and now is when we should be talking about the starter. I turned this thing off, and it's kind of out of problem. Okay, starter. Let's start with thinking about the very beginning of it and saying, oh, what do? I want to start making sourdough. And the answer is you can just create your own. There's enough natural yeasty culture type stuff in the air everywhere, but maybe some places less than others. For example, not that you would ever start a sourdough culture in a barn, but I bet a barn would be a great place to start one because of the natural fermentation that's kind of always happening with hay and this and that. I bet it would work really well. But they say that if you have never had any sourdough starter in your home, it might take a little longer, which is interesting to me. I didn't read that when I first started, but I believe that makes sense to me. So to start one, all you have to do is take some yeast. No, sorry. I'll say this. No commercial yeast has ever entered the picture in the Wheels whole regime. So it's kind of fun. All you have to do is take flour and water and put it together, and eventually with time and making some changes at the right time, that's all that it will ever be. So it's water and flour, right? So, you know, that's all this is. This is 100% flour and water, and this is my starter. And if you put flour and water together in a way to get one started, to start one from scratch, I would say you could put it in together, keep it at the right temperature between 80 and 90 degrees, and let it sit there for 24 hours, maybe another 12 hours, 36 hours, and then you'll swap some of it out and put in some more flour and water. Because in that time, if there is any, let's call it the very small amount of natural leavening that it can get together and start doing its process, will already need more fuel. And the flour is the fuel. So in essence, taking a little bit out, taking what little bit of yeasty culture is in that part, and putting it in with some more water and some more flour, feeds it. So now you take what anything that may have been accumulated more than what would have happened in one batch doesn't just die because it dries out or because it sits too long. Now you've added some more fuel to it, and it can amplify again. So over like a week, if you do that regularly, like every 24 hours or 36 hours, and you monitor it, and you're putting in an even amount of flour and water, and about, let's just say, approximately equal amounts of the new flour and water to the starter, you'll come out with a live starter that, you know, doesn't quite look as vital as this. This is what I would describe as finely tuned and optimized. But after a week, you'll have one that will start doing this. And it will start doing it in the way that you want it to, in a cyclical way. Every 12 hours, you can add some more flour and water to it, and it will feed it, and it will lift up and boost up and hit to a high point and then start to diminish after 12 hours. Now, if you read about sourdough starter, you'll read, I'd say there's maybe 100 different ways to get one started, and there's probably 100 or more different ways to maintain one. If you're in Alaska and you're learning from some old guru, Alaskan outback hunter or something, you may say, oh, well, all we ever do is we take 1 part of starter, 1 part of water, and 1 part of flour in equal weights, and put them all together and let it go for, who knows, 3 or 4 days, depending on the temperature, right? 100% valid way of doing it. The vitality and the energy that it has and the stuff will not nearly be as concentrated as this, because it will love that new feed, and it will zoom it through it quickly, and then it will sort of like kind of get nasty, what they call a little hooch on top, or like a little bit of alcohol sits on top, and it might even start to turn a little dark and dull looking. But then all you have to do is put some more flour and water in it, and it just kind of zooms back up. But one like this will make your bread lift higher. It will be more like you can count on it. In some ways, a lot like commercial yeast. One thing you can say about commercial yeast is you can put a certain amount of it with flour and water and a certain amount of commercial yeast, and it will pretty much do the same thing all the time. And I'd say that's what's happening with this one. I can do, as long as this one's at the right time of the day, I can take a certain amount of that and put it with more flour and water, and I can have almost exactly the same thing happen, just like a recipe is supposed to work. So in that regard, this is a huge variable. If this is kind of flat and dull, or let's just say if I took it in the middle of the day, after I had fed it in the morning, it wouldn't have gotten as vibrant, and it wouldn't have as much culture in it, and so therefore it wouldn't do the same thing that it would if I took it, I typically feed it 8 in the morning and 8 at night.
It's like having a dog. You gotta feed it in the morning and night. What's that?
just open the door. This thing has a quick enough thermometer on it that it says it's a 275. So I don't have that at home, but it's hard to believe that it goes down that fast.
So what happens if you're gone for a week?
Great question. So in the process of starting one, moving along through a week of constant kind of, not constant at all, and since you only have to touch it every 24 or 36 hours, you come to a week or so, and it starts to get pretty vibrant. At some point, if you are maintaining this thing now, after you get to that point, you can start to maintain it more regularly and more systematically. At first, you're just doing everything you can to facilitate it catching on and starting and being fed at about the right time, so that it keeps growing and getting more intense. At the point of where this one's at, it's fully as intense as it can get, and all I'm doing is trying to maintain that on a regular basis so that I can keep a cycle, so I can make bread when I need to, right? So if I don't need to make bread for a week, or if I'm going to be gone for a week, the question is, well, what do I do? Do I maintain it every 12 hours all week long? The answer is, why would you? Unless you just want to learn and practice and be intimate with it, right? If you're at the pizzeria, well, they need 100 to 150 bread pizza balls every single day. On Friday, it's maybe 200, and Saturday, it's a lot. And maybe, who knows, maybe there's some scenario where they're closed on Monday, and well, what do we do then? You can't just throw away? I'll say, as long as I worked at the wheel, we never threw one dough ball away. It's because the beautiful part is that it lasts from 72 hours is what the ideal is. We have each one dated, and you'll see a photo in here. You'll see a picture of, you see me pulling out a big batch of dough here. But there's one picture of all the stacks of these dough trays that look a lot like this, but they're bigger, in there. And they each one is for each day. So the one is a 72 hours, and depending on whether they went through faster or slower, you could use it one ahead of time or one further away, right? Each time, and that adds to its flexibility, and it's why they've never had to throw one away. That they didn't, there's never been a situation, maybe with the exception of the cooler not working or something like that, where they had to throw any away. But in the year that I worked there, they never even threw one all away because it went bad.
So do you just leave it on the counter?
No, you put it in the fridge. I think the answer is you put it in the fridge. You can, in the fridge it can last, I'd say, really easily it can last a couple weeks. It can even last a month. You might have to do a little bit more work to get it back to a full vibrancy. But even when you do it for a day or two in the fridge, it's not like you can pop it out and expect it to be as vibrant as this one. The first round. Like what you'll do is you'll pull it out of the fridge, you'll add some flour and water to it, and you'll let it do its 12 hours thing, and then you'll pull a little bit out, add some more flour and water to it, and it'll come back.
Are you talking about the dough ball or the starter?
We're talking about the starter. So I didn't tell you the recipe of the starter yet. The recipe to get one going is pretty much 1-to-1-to-1 over the course of a week. And again, the nuances and things like that, you can go to The Perfect Loaf, or another book that's really good is called The Tartine Bakery in San Francisco. But the recipe that you'll find on The Perfect Loaf is the recipe that I use, and I found it to work really well. And it's a 1 part starter to 5 parts flour and 5 parts water. And so what that means is that you're throwing away a ton of it all the time, potentially, right? Let's just say, for example, in 12 hours, it's multiplying times 11. And so from now until tomorrow, what's 11 times 11? 121. So what I started with today in the morning, by tomorrow morning, I could have 121 of them. Like, wow, that sounds like the wheel, where they're selling 120 pizzas a day. And that means I could literally have started with just one
Right.
part, right? Let's just say, if a dough ball weighs 390 grams, like at the wheel, then I could have 390 grams of starter on one morning, and the very next day I could conceivably have enough starter to make that many dough balls, which you don't make it from starter, but like it's just an amazing amount of multiplication and math associated with it. And so the challenge is how do I minimize how much I'm throwing away, maintain a really vital starter? And the answer is, well, you make all kinds of extra things, like pancakes, and, who knows, muffins and bagels and pretzels, and, baguettes and this and that. You could become your own bakery with this, how much this would actually do, right? Unless you stick it in the fridge. Then it can sit in the fridge for a long time.
Do you ever get contamination? Because I get like a crustiness, like a white.
I'll say that I've read a lot about it. I've had maybe some thoughts that things weren't going quite right with it. And the answer is, I don't think I've ever had any contamination. I think that I thought that I might have. And one thing I can say is that it's incredibly resilient. And so what I say is, if there's any feeling that you think that you've got, some people, depending on what the temperature is and how long it's been sitting, they might say it might get a little mold on it or something like that. If you can scrape away the top a little bit and just pull it, again, you don't need very much of it. And so even a little bit. So for example, if I make this available to you guys, today you could conceivably take 5 grams home, and tomorrow you could make 2 loaves of bread.
Wow.
Right? That's all it would take. Just a tiny little bit, feed it when you get home. Tomorrow this time, and then one more day, and you would be able to have as much as this and more. Right? So it's exponential, it grows up.
I use a starter that's naturally local yeast, but I've also bought San Francisco dough yeast to make starter. Do you believe in the myth that the local yeast overtakes your store-bought starter? Does it really matter?
Well, I would say that there's no mathematics. To my mind, I could say that there's no logic in understanding that somehow what starter you started with yesterday is what you've got today. I mean, literally, if in 24, again, because it multiplied by 121, then whatever you had yesterday, you've added so much new flour and water to it, and then if you did that again in 24 hours, then the amount that you started with would be like a teaspoon, and you'd end up with a whole bucket full. And so therefore, I think the flavor or the whatever sourdough starter would impart on it isn't about that starter as much as the way that you care for it. So what I would say is that if you wanted to create a sourdough tasting San Francisco sourdough bread style, right, what I would describe as a richer, fermented kind of a taste to it, what you don't do is you don't use this. You would take it and you let it go 2 or 3 days at a time and let it get hoochier. And then you might even do the same thing with your loaf of bread, in the sense that you don't let it rise up in 3 or 4 hours. You put a very small amount of yeast in it and you let it set a long time. So like you're kind of like, you got to do and be flexible with what it is that you're wanting out of it. And the more time you give it and the more sour you let it get, the more flavor it will have.
Okay.
I have a question.
This is a question over here first.
And this could probably be really obviously dependent or relative to the starter, but I'm just curious, like what percentage of your starter you're discarding every time you feed it?
Well, it'd be 1/11. I'm discarding. There are, 10 11ths.
Okay,
So you're discarding 1/10 or 1/11, or you're discarding 11?
Yeah, let me make it, I'm gonna say it a little bit differently. So before we're done here, maybe now's a good time, but maybe as soon as these bagels come out, I'll feed this, and you'll see a little bit that, like how much is left over and whatever. But that multiplication of tiny amount of starter, lots of flour, lots of water, gets set up so that every time you're discarding 10 parts and only keeping 1.
right.
Right?
And then I guess ideally too, for me, like I bake about once a week, ideally what I'm discarding would be used to make that bread, so that it's not like going to waste, but then that also affects like how often I'm feeding it too, which isn't as often, but yeah.
I think let's just say this. Typically, I don't know the exact ratio of every single loaf of bread, but in general, the amount of starter or yeast or something that does the rising part to the loaf of bread is a relatively small amount. You know, like I told you earlier, like my loaf for these bagels is like 200 starter to 800 flour. So, you know, 1 to 4. Not quite 1 to 5, but 1 to 4. And so that scenario would mean that you can't really use more starter than would fit in a recipe unless you want to play around and see what happens. I think there's so much opportunity for exploration to see what happens. Like, let's say, for example, is that I use this and I just have a tiny little bit of it that I need. I take the rest and I put it in this thing, which is kind of like what I would say is old starter. And then I would say, oh, let's put all of that old starter into a loaf of bread and just see what happens. The answer is, I don't know exactly what happens because I haven't tried that test. But if you try to make a whole loaf of bread out of this and just add a little bit more flour and water, I don't know. It would be weird, I think. It might have a lot more taste, right? And it might not have some of the elasticity because that flour's been sitting in the more wet environment for considerably longer.
Yeah.
But trying to use all that discard is not easy.
One time I almost used all my sourdough starter for a loaf because I didn't
Yeah, I think that's one reason why you. That's one reason why
I
you
find I was
find
like, this is all my starter.
people are so willing to give you the starter.
It's a little bit less.
Because it doesn't cost anything, and just throwing it away. My wife hates it when I throw it in the trash can because after a couple of days it starts to stinking.
How do you, here's the thing, you don't have very many 80 to 90 degree butter,
Yeah,
and I know my oven doesn't go lower than 100, so how do you get,
that's a great question. I have a house like that in the sense that I have a house that's primarily heated with a wood stove, and so like all these days like this, like it's either too hot when I stoke up my fire, or if I decide not to go with the fire, then it's too cold. So my wife just got me something really cool. And I should have invented it. I mean, I should have created my own. Wouldn't be that hard to think about. Creating like a little proofing box where you can monitor it. And what I've got now is something called a Broad and Taylor proofing system that is basically like this little pop-up box. It is, I do believe it's in one of my photos, and I don't know where it's at in the sequence there. But it is a thing that helps to regulate that temperature so that you can set it at 80 and know how long it takes, right? Otherwise, you're just sort of guessing and annoyed usually that, oh, it's not doing what I wanted. Oh, it's going too fast. Like, there's a lot to it.
so it's called what's the name of it again?
I think it's called a proofing box or something like that.
A lot of people.
Oh yeah, Broad, B-R-O-D, ampersand, Taylor.
What about just the oven light on?
Yeah, I would say an oven light, again, that might give you some sense, but monitoring that temperature is ideal. This
90
proofing
degrees.
box system allows you to have like, just set it and say, hey, I want it 82 or whatever.
Without the proofing box, you keep the starter on the counter.
But you couldn't keep it in there yet.
I would say
For
almost
starter,
all the time I keep
you
my
wanna
own
leave the
counter,
stove
unless
on
I'm
it.
not planning to take care of it for a couple of days.
Yeah, so if you're not
I could see making a proofing box using a light bulb or something like that.
That's what I'm saying. As soon as I say I don't want to mess with it for a couple of days, it goes in the fridge. The fridge will slow it down to the point of like almost not doing anything. But it does deteriorate over like days. Like again, it isn't like one day makes a huge difference, but like if you left it in there for 3 weeks, the vibrancy of it would diminish considerably.
so then more work to
Maybe an extra 12-hour cycle, or maybe 2 extra 12-hour cycles would boost it back up. One of the things that I haven't said either is that I typically use a rye flour as an element in the flour that I feed with, that I have read and believe that it has more natural environment that has the culture of yeast in it that will help to give it extra boost.
I'm coming from nowhere.
Yeah.
You've been talking about starter.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what I think I perceive.
Okay.
You take a small amount of starter, put it in another vessel, and you put your flour and water in, and you let it set. I'm trying to figure out how you get the piece of material to make a piece of bread.
Yeah. Look. I feel like I talked a lot about that in general, but let me give it a more demonstration. I've been waiting to kind of feed this one, and I think that process will help you see it a little bit.
But I mean, I'm saying, so if I want to make some bread, I have to start 2 or 3 days in advance to let this grow and
Yeah.
add some more flour and water.
Yeah,
and let it grow.
to give you an answer to that basic idea would be that if you wanted to make bagels, you would need to, if you didn't have anything, let's say you don't have anything.
So say I had starter.
Oh, if you have starter, then you would be able to just do a recipe and pull some of your starter out at the right time in its cycle. Again, it has a cycle that again, in mine, at 8 o'clock in the morning, it's what they call ripe. It's been eating all of its sugars and stuff in it all night long, and it's been 12 hours, and it's time to feed it. So I feed it or I use it. If I feed it, I take just a tiny little bit out, and I put in new flour and water, and then it goes for another 12 hours. And it really can't be used during that time. Meaning that if I wanted to bake it new,
That's in a separate vessel.
maybe, I would say yes, maybe. Like, that would be where a scenario would be.
Bread with something out of that container. It's too small.
Wouldn't you just get whatever you're taking out and put it aside and then bake later?
Yes, I think what you would normally do, what you would describe as your normal discard, if you're not using it, you could pull aside and hold it until it was time that day. And depending on where it's at in its vitality, you could put it in the fridge and then pull it back out or whatever. But
Vitality is a great thing to talk about, but it's really bubbly. What are you looking for when it's at its optimal? That's on the screen right now?
Double in size, maybe?
Double in size, or
That's
when it's really bubbly, right? And
yeah, I
it's
would
really-
say you can look at the top of it and you can see that there's a lot of little bubbles in it. You can see that one of the things it does is it goes up
Yep.
and then it comes down. So it's like an inflation process, and it literally is like 12 hours. Like you feed it. What I do is I put a little rubber band around here, and that's the state that I have just fed it in. And then like 3 hours in, it comes up a little more. 6 hours in, a little more. 9 hours in, pretty darn high, almost as high as it's going to get. And up until this point, it's kind of got a dome on the top. And then at about 11, 12 hours, the dome starts to flatten out. And in fact, it starts to maybe even recede just a little bit. And that's what I would say that's the right starter, at the very top.
Thank you, that is really great information,
Yeah.
thank you.
But see, that's a starter you're talking about.
Yeah.
Where do you create a ball that you're gonna put in the oven?
Yeah. Well,
Is that there, or do you mix that starter with flour?
think of this as yeast.
Okay.
Right? So when you normally make a loaf of bread, you would use yeast, flour, water, salt, maybe oil, or maybe sugar, right? Those are the basic things. Depending on what bread you're making, you can throw in milk or something, right? But all those things make the bread, and you need a little bit of yeast or starter. This is almost exactly like yeast, except that it's alive currently in its state, and it hasn't been processed in any way, and it's not been just sort of waiting stagnant like commercial yeast is, right? So some small amount of this, and the weight of this versus the weight of a dry starter or commercial yeast is going to be dramatically different, right? Like 200 grams of this, if I put 200 grams of commercial yeast in my bread, I'd end up with potentially it would just like blow up like a bomb almost. Not really.
similar to that white stuff over there, and they sell them at Kmart for baking.
Yeah.
You can load it up online. It's about $200.
Yes, King Arthur is a good, I think a good resource. I think that, of course, I talked with Rachel already, and she doesn't have these things, proofing boxes, but she may decide to get them in. But I think they're a great thing. Yeah, all the other stuff that you see down here are critical things, and I haven't talked about all of them yet, but I'm just going to try to top these down.
So if you're gonna make a whole grain loaf,
A whole grain loaf?
yeah, it
Okay.
doesn't really matter whether this is whole grain or not, right? The starter wouldn't necessarily be whole grain.
I think the answer to that is no, it doesn't matter. The amount of starter that goes in is usually so small that, that it doesn't significantly impact whether something is whole grain or not.
Okay, so I'm confused a little bit. The best time to take a sample from my starter to make a loaf of bread is just before I feed it, or when it's at its,
Right when I would say ideally right when it's peak or just a little after it's
when it's peaked?
yeah.
Which is
Okay.
around 12 hours. That's a good tip. For me, it's a good tip because I'm always
Right.
with the
I love all these questions about starter, and I can see the little wheels turning in your head. And interesting that that's the name of the pizzeria. And we named our starter at the wheel. I named it the hub. I'm also a big bicycle.
yeah.
So, and if you look at this starter, in fact, anyone who wants to, this is a great time for a little break. If anyone who wants to come up and look at this starter, you can see that it's not reached its peak yet. It's kind of got a little dome on top, so it's still lifting. And this one actually has been going longer than 12 hours because it was supposed to be ready almost at 11 a.m. this morning. But I know my house is cold, and I kind of hoped that it wouldn't peak before you guys had a chance to look at it, so you could see that little dome. But typically, what you see is like a little dome, and the holiness on, the bubbles kind of popping up in it, and then it starts to recede a little bit, and then if you wait another couple of hours, it might go down quite a bit. That doesn't mean that it's, let's say, killed off all those cultures that are in there. It just means that they're hungry and needing more food, and ideally you want to feed them right when they're the hungriest, and that's right when they're at the peak. And my sense would be, and again, I'm no microbiologist, but my sense would be that you're kind of training the yeast in there to want more and to ask for more and to make more. So you want to get the ones that are the strongest and the fastest eaters, and you want to facilitate them by giving them the food when they need it, which is the peak, right? Okay, I revved it up, and so I'm not, again, an expert on the microbiology of it all.
So you said take a break?
Yeah, I'd say if you want to jump up and move around, take a break.
And I want to see your starter.
Yeah, let's reconvene in 5 minutes. Maybe some of these bagels will be ready